Welcome to my channel. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and like. Loneliness clung to Caleb like the red dust coating the barren fields of Jericho 9. It wrapped around him, thick and familiar, like a tattered coat, frayed at the edges but still warm enough to endure the endless days. Out here, at the edge of this scattered colony, where jagged stone hills sliced the horizon, no one came calling. No roar of starships overhead, no blinking calm signals, just the howl of wind through rocky crevices, sharp as a blade, mingling with the steady hum of the air purifier in his small house. And somewhere deep in his chest, the steady, slow beat of his heart, counting seconds no one else cared to notice. Jericho 9 wasn't a place for living. It was a place for surviving, for forgetting, for disappearing. After years of interstellar war, after betrayals, by comrades, by ideals, by his own faith, Caleb had chosen this place. A forgotten corner of the universe where even the stars seemed too weary to shine, their light dim and distant, like promises long broken. A place to hide, if you truly wanted to. And Caleb had wanted to desperately. His house, a squat block of steel and gray stone nestled against a hillside, was all that remained of his old world. It wasn't beautiful, wasn't comfortable, just a sturdy shell against the planet's biting cold. Inside, everything bore the mark of simplicity: a worn wooden table, a few wobbly chairs, an old fireplace that needed a few whacks each morning to coax it to life. On a shelf, a handful of tattered books from Earth, now dust-covered, untouched for years. A small photograph, faded by time, lay face down in a corner, the face of someone, a memory he didn't dare confront. Caleb lived here, day after day, fixing machines, checking the air purifier, staring out at the endless red plains. He didn't wait for anything, didn't hope for anything. The universe had taught him that hope was a luxury, and he'd paid too dearly to learn that lesson. Tonight, like every night, he sat at the table, the weak glow of an oil lamp casting shadows on his scarred, calloused hands. A screwdriver rested in his grip, dismantling an old air filter, bolts clinking softly as they fell to the table. The task wasn't necessary. The machine worked fine, but it kept his hands busy, kept his mind from drifting to darker places. Outside, the wind howled louder, carrying red dust that scratched against the windows, a sound like fingernails on glass. Caleb didn't look up. He was used to Jericho 9's harshness, used to its nightly screams, as if the planet itself carried an unspoken pain. So when the knock came, sharp and hesitant on the metal door, it cut through the silence like a knife. Caleb froze, his hand tightening around the screwdriver, his heart slamming once, loud and clear, like an alarm in his chest. No one came here. Ever. The nearest settlement was a day's walk away, and no one was mad enough to cross the red plains at night. Another knock, softer, almost desperate, as if whoever stood outside was using their last ounce of strength. The soldier's instinct in him, still there, though buried under years of dust, flared to life. He wanted to bolt the door, draw the curtains, pretend he'd heard nothing. Jericho 9 wasn't a place for opening doors to strangers. But another part of him, a part he thought had died long ago, the part that once believed in kindness, that fought for something greater than himself, stirred. It was small, fragile, but enough to make him set the screwdriver down. The metal clinked faintly against the table, a whisper in the quiet room. His heavy boots scraped the stone floor as he crossed the room, each step slow, cautious. His hand hovered over the door's latch, fingers brushing the cold metal. His eyes scanned the view through the small window, where the jagged hills stretched under a bruised purple sky, speckled with faint stars. Nothing moved. No lights, no shapes, no signs of life. But the hairs on his neck stood up, a familiar prickle from his war days, when danger lurked in the shadows. Somewhere out there, something waited, cold as a wound that never healed. Caleb took a deep breath, his hand tightening on the latch. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know why. But he opened the door, letting the chill of Jericho 9 rush in, carrying the scent of red dust and scorched metal. A figure, no, a woman, collapsed into his arms, her body terrifyingly light, trembling uncontrollably. He caught her, feeling her fragility with every touch, skin taut over bones, as if she were made to shatter. Her skin shimmered a pale blue, glinting beneath dust and bruises, like a lake reflecting starlight. Her long black hair, tangled and wild, spilled down her back like a storm-torn cascade. Faint golden patterns ran along her arms and neck, pulsing weakly, like the light of a dying star. Her eyes cracked open, blazing gold, wild with panic, locking onto his with the desperation of someone who'd run until they broke. Her lips moved, trying to speak, but the words dissolved into shallow, ragged breaths. Then she crumpled, her body going limp in his arms. Caleb held her easily, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her shoulders. She was light as a child, as if the universe had drained her of all strength. He didn't hesitate, though later he'd wonder why. Perhaps a shard of the man he'd been, the soldier who saved lives, who believed every soul mattered, had woken when he saw her. Perhaps it was the memory of his own desperation, of needing a door to open in the dark. He kicked the door shut, the metal slamming with a sharp clang, a defiance to the darkness outside. Then he carried her inside, his steps steady on the stone floor, bringing a stranger into the house he'd built to shut out the world. The fire in the hearth had died, leaving only embers flickering faintly, like whispers fading into the dark. Caleb laid the strange woman on the old couch, its wood creaking under her slight weight. Her body trembled uncontrollably, like a leaf torn free by Jericho 9's biting winds. He pulled a threadbare blanket from a nearby armchair, draping it over her, the rough fabric folding around her fragile form. Her clothes, or what remained of them, were tattered, caked with red dust and dried blood, barely shielding her from the planet's piercing cold. Her bare feet, exposed beneath the blanket's edge, were crisscrossed with scratches, a map of a brutal journey. Her knuckles were bloodied, nails broken, telling a story of days spent fleeing, of clinging to life. Caleb knelt beside her, taking a deep breath to steady himself, but his chest tightened as his eyes traced her wounds. He examined her carefully, his rough hands gentle, as if a wrong touch might break her. A deep laser burn marred her calf, its edges swollen and red, healing but still painful. He recognized the wound, military grade, not an accident. Angry welts circled her wrists, raw and deep, speaking of restraints, tight and cruel, applied with intent. No broken bones, at least not that he could tell, but her body was spent. Her skin was ice cold, though her pale blue complexion still shimmered faintly, as if an inner light fought to stay alive. She burned with fever, her breath short and sharp, each one a small battle. Caleb clenched his jaw, pushing back the questions swirling in his mind. Who did this to her? Now wasn't the time to ask. She needed warmth, water, food, now. He stood, moving quickly to the small kitchen corner, where a metal water jug sat silently on a shelf. A clean bowl, a scrap of cloth torn from an old shirt, and he returned to her side. Kneeling again, he dipped the cloth in water and gently wiped the red dust from her forehead. She shuddered, though still unconscious, and the movement stabbed at his heart. He continued, careful to avoid the bruises on her cheeks and neck, where faint golden patterns pulsed like the heartbeat of a fading star. He didn't know who she was, but seeing her there, fragile and broken, stirred an old pain, memories of comrades he couldn't save, faces blurred by the smoke of war. He shook his head, banishing the thoughts. This wasn't the time to drown in the past. Caleb grabbed a cup, filled it from the jug, and sat beside her. He lifted her head, sliding a hand under her tangled black hair, feeling the fragility of her skull beneath her skin. He trickled water over her cracked lips, careful as if tending something breakable. She coughed weakly, a small but sharp sound, then swallowed. Good. He repeated the process, drop by drop, until she took more, though she didn't wake. Every movement, however slight, was a victory, a sign she was still fighting. But in his mind questions churned, sharp as Jericho 9's winds. Who was she? Where had she come from? The nearest settlement was a day's trek through perilous red plains. The universe out there was vast, teeming with creatures, civilizations, and threats he'd only glimpsed in war stories. Some wore faces as beautiful as hers, but beauty didn't mean safety. Trust wasn't something Caleb gave easily, not anymore. He'd learned that kindness came with a cost, one he'd paid too many times. Yet here he was, warming a stranger in his home, risking the fragile peace he'd fought so hard to claim. He wondered if this was a mistake. But looking at her, her golden eyes closed, her breasts weak but stubborn, he knew he couldn't have done otherwise. Some habits never died, like the way he'd once charged through gunfire to drag a comrade to safety, or the way he believed a single act could change everything. He rose, stoking the fire, tossing dry logs onto the embers. Flames roared to life, their golden orange glow dancing on the stone walls, banishing the creeping cold. Caleb pulled a chair near the hearth and sat, his eyes stealing glances at her. The golden patterns on her neck pulsed with her breaths, faint but steady. She was alive, and that, at least, was enough. He checked the front door, locking it tight, then the windows, drawing the curtains. But unease prickled beneath his skin, an itch he couldn't scratch. He knew too well that where there was a fugitive, hunters weren't far behind. Her wounds weren't accidents. Someone, or something, had driven her here, and they might be out there, lurking in the shadows of the red plains. A faint sound echoed from afar, wind howling, an engine's hum, or just his imagination stirring old fears. Caleb gripped the chair's arms, knuckles whitening. His breathing slowed, the way it had before battles, when death was a heartbeat away. He looked at her again, her small form under the blanket, and a cold resolve rose in him. Whatever had chased her here wouldn't take her without going through him. He wasn't the soldier he'd been, but he still knew how to fight. And this time, he wouldn't let anyone be left in the dark. Caleb woke to the creak of the stone floor under weight, a small but sharp sound, like stealthy footsteps in the dark. In the dim glow of the dying hearth, where only a few embers flickered, he thought for a moment it was a dream. The knock at the door, the frail body collapsing into his arms, the golden eyes wild with fear. But then he turned, and she was there. The strange woman sat on the old couch, the threadbare blanket clutched tightly around her thin shoulders, as if it were her only shield against the world. Her long black hair, tangled and wild, spilled down like a cascade torn by Jericho 9's winds, half hiding her face. The faint golden patterns on her neck pulsed weakly with her breaths, like the light of a star struggling not to fade. She was watching him, awake, alert, her blazing golden eyes locked on him, glowing in the dark. The tension between them was fragile as crystal, as if one wrong move could shatter the moment. Caleb stayed still, his body frozen in the chair by the hearth, afraid a sudden motion might make her bolt like a cornered animal. He knew that look, the look of someone used to danger, used to calculating every second to survive. "You're safe here," he said softly, his voice hoarse from sleep, each word chosen carefully to preserve the delicate balance between them. She didn't answer right away. She just watched, her golden eyes scanning his face, searching for something, a hint of threat, a trace of deceit, or perhaps a shred of kindness she no longer dared to believe in. Time hung suspended, filled only by the crackle of embers and the wail of wind outside, like the cry of a planet that never rested. Finally she spoke, her voice low but clear, carrying an alien cadence, like an echo from a distant world. "Where am I?" Her words carried no language barrier, though Caleb sensed a subtle difference, as if she were translating her thoughts through an unseen lens. He exhaled, relieved, though he hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. "My place," he said slowly. "The edge of Jericho 9's colony. You knocked. Well, more like collapsed at my door." He added a touch of dry humor, hoping to ease the tension, but her eyes didn't waver, still sharp, still probing. A flicker of panic crossed her face, swift as a cloud's shadow over the red plains. Her thin, scratched hands tightened on the blanket's edge, knuckles whitening. "I was running," she said, eyes dropping, her voice heavy with shame, as if admitting it were a defeat. "I didn't mean to come here." Her words hung in the air, weighty, like a confession no one had asked for. Caleb sat up, elbows resting on his knees, joints creaking after a night dozing in the chair. He leaned forward but kept his distance, giving her room to breathe. "You're not in trouble with me," he said, his voice steady but not forceful. He knew what it felt like to be cornered, to brace for a blow from any direction. He'd been there, in the long nights of war, when every shadow might hide a blade. Outside, a faint rumble sounded from the plains, low and distant, like machinery stirring in the dark. Caleb tensed, muscles tightening, but he kept his face calm, not wanting to frighten her further. Not yet time for alarm. But Lira, she seemed to sense the unease too, like an animal catching the scent of danger. Her fingers twitched on the blanket, and Caleb noticed the bruises on her wrists, red welts, deep and cruel, the mark of someone who knew no mercy. A quiet anger flared in him, but he smothered it. Anger wouldn't help now. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer, an invitation rather than a demand. She hesitated, her gaze wavering, as if her name were a secret too heavy to share. Then she lifted her chin slightly, a small but defiant gesture. "Lira," she said. The name was soft yet strong, like a distant star glinting in Jericho 9's sky. "I'm Caleb," he replied, his voice low, letting his name hang between them, fragile as a thread connecting two strangers. Lira shivered, pulling the blanket closer, as if the planet's cold had seeped into her bones. Without thinking, Caleb reached for the firewood by the hearth, selecting the driest logs and tossing them onto the embers. The fire flared, its golden-orange light dancing on the stone walls, chasing away the lingering chill. Warmth spread, and he saw her shoulders relax, if only a fraction. "Are you hurt anywhere?" he asked, his voice gentle, tending the fire as if the question were just part of the task. Lira hesitated, her eyes drifting to her hands, where scratches and bruises told a story she wasn't ready to share. "A little," she said, her voice barely audible. "But not enough to die." A hint of bitter humor laced her words, and Caleb recognized it instantly. The shield he'd once carried, the one that got him through the war when everything else crumbled. He corked his lips, not quite a smile, but a silent acknowledgement. "I've got a med kit in the kitchen," he said, standing, his joints popping softly. "Nothing fancy, but it'll do. Got clean clothes too, if you want. Might be big, but better than what you've got on." Lira nodded faintly but didn't move, sitting there, the firelight painting her blue skin in shades of gold and shadow, like a living painting steeped in darkness. Her eyes were distant, lost in memories Caleb could only guess at. He didn't push. Trust wasn't something you could force, not in a universe like this, where every door could lead to danger. It had to grow, breath by breath, choice by choice, like the fire he just rekindled, small but persistent, enough to hold the darkness at bay, if only for a moment. The pale light of Jericho 9's morning seeped through the window, casting long streaks across the stone floor, like fragile fingers reaching into the room. The fire in the hearth had long died, leaving only gray ash, but the room held a lingering warmth, wrapping Caleb and Lira in a brittle sense of safety. Caleb hadn't slept after their brief conversation the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Lira huddled on the couch flickered in his mind, not because of her bruises or the exhaustion etched into her frame, but because of the quiet resilience in how she held herself together, refusing to shatter. She'd survived things he could only guess at, and it made him unable to look away, as if she were a small flame that might gutter out without protection. He sat there, in the chair by the hearth, his rough hands clasped tightly, watching her every small movement in sleep, until the dawn's light stirred them both. Lira stirred under the threadbare blanket, her eyelids fluttering before opening, blinking slowly in the morning haze. Her long black hair spilled over her shoulders, catching the faint light like silk woven from darkness, tangled but strangely beautiful. She sat up slowly, her movements cautious, as if her body were still testing whether this world was safe. For the first time, Caleb noticed color returning to her pale blue skin, a faint shimmer, like a lake reflecting the sky. The golden patterns on her neck and arms pulsed more steadily, no longer as weak as the night before. She met his gaze, and for a moment, time stilled. She gave a slight nod, not quite a smile, but something, a recognition, an invisible thread beginning to form between them. "You didn't sleep," she said softly, her voice low, carrying the timbre of someone used to guarding secrets. Caleb stood, his joints creaking, muscles aching from a night spent vigilant in the hard chair. Didn't feel right, he replied, his voice dry, as if he were only talking about the weather. Didn't want you waking up alone. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he saw Lyra's eyes soften, a flicker of warmth passing through before she looked away, as if kindness were too foreign to face. I'm not used to kindness, she admitted, her voice small, almost dissolving into the air. Caleb moved to the hearth, busying himself with selecting dry logs from the pile by the wall, tossing them onto the ashes. He struck a match, and the fire roared to life, its golden-orange glow dancing on the stone walls, banishing the morning chill. You'll have to get used to it, he said, his tone even but carrying an unshakable certainty. At least here. They ate breakfast in silence, sharing bread toasted on the stove, spread with a bit of jam from Caleb's meager stores, a luxury on Jericho 9, where everything was earned with sweat or blood. The silence wasn't awkward but filled with the cautious beginnings of trust, like the first steps on a fragile bridge. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye, noting how she held the bread, careful but ravenous, as if unsure there'd be another meal. He didn't ask, didn't press. She'd speak when she was ready, or not at all, and he respected that. After the meal, Caleb washed the dishes in a small basin, the clink of metal against stone a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the house. Lira stood by the window, her thin arms wrapped around herself, her golden eyes scanning the vast red plains outside. Her stance was tense, shoulders rigid, like an animal sensing a predator drawing near. The pale light illuminated her skin, making the golden pattern shimmer, but it couldn't hide the wariness in her gaze. Expecting someone? Caleb asked, not looking up from the basin, his voice light but sharp, like a blade testing its mark. Lira didn't answer right away, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where jagged stone hills cut across the bruised purple sky. Then she spoke, soft but certain. They'll come for me. Sooner or later. Her words carried weight, like a prophecy carved in stone. Caleb dried his hands on a rag by the stove, turning to face her, his eyes narrowing, not with suspicion but with understanding. Then we'll be ready, he said simply, as if discussing a broken door in need of repair. Lira frowned, her gaze wavering, as if startled by his certainty. You don't even know who I am, she said, her voice holding a hint of challenge, but also confusion. No, Caleb agreed, crossing his arms, leaning against the table's edge. But I know the look of someone running to survive. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers, not pressing but sincere. I've been one of them. His words hung in the air, offering no further explanation, but enough for Lira to sense he wasn't a stranger to the darkness she fled. She looked at him, her golden eyes flaring, as if weighing whether to trust. Then she nodded faintly, a small gesture, but enough to make the bridge between them a little stronger. By dusk, as Jericho 9's light shifted to a deep crimson, like blood spilling across the plains, Caleb emerged from the tool shed after a day spent checking machinery. His hand paused on the worn door handle, his eyes fixed on a thin trail of dust rising on the horizon. Not wind. Wind on this planet didn't move like that, not so steady, not with purpose. Someone was coming. His heart thudded, not from fear, but from the soldier's instinct sharpening, keen as a honed blade. He turned back to the house, his steps quick but not panicked. Lira stood in the doorway, her frail frame radiating tension, like a taut string ready to snap. She didn't ask, didn't need to. Her eyes had seen the dust, and their gazes met, silent but knowing. Their time was running out, and the shadows on the hill were no longer a vague warning. They were real, and they were coming. Inside the house, the air was heavy, as if the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. The crimson light of Jericho 9's sunset seeped through the windows, bathing everything in a somber hue, like blood pooling on the floor. Caleb checked each window latch with practiced precision, his fingers brushing cold metal, his eyes flicking to the red plains outside. The dust trail on the horizon had grown larger, closer, carrying an unmistakable warning. Someone, or something, was coming. Lira stood a few steps away, her thin arms wrapped tightly around herself, the threadbare blanket abandoned on the couch, a relic of the fragile safety they'd briefly shared. Her shoulders were stiff, her golden eyes blazing with tension, but not fear, a readiness born of someone used to facing danger. "We've got time," Caleb said, forcing his voice to stay steady, as if convincing himself. "Not much, but enough." Lira nodded faintly, but her gaze didn't leave the window, as if she could see the hunter's shapes through the red haze. "They'll find me, Caleb," she said softly, her voice certain, carrying the weight of an inescapable truth. "They always do." Her words sliced through the air, sharp as Jericho 9's winds, and Caleb felt a chill race down his spine. He stopped, turning to face her, his gaze steady but unyielding. "Then we'll give them a fight they won't want," he replied, his voice calm but laced with the ferocity he thought he'd buried with his war days. He moved to an old drawer in the corner, yanking it open with a dry creak. Inside, an aging laser pistol lay nestled, its worn grip clean and ready. He checked it swiftly, fingers gliding over the controls, a motion as familiar as breathing. Lira watched him, her expression unreadable, as if weighing whether he was her savior or a new threat. "I should have told you sooner," she said, her voice low, heavy with regret. "About who I am. Why I'm running." Caleb leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his heavy boots scuffing the stone floor. "I figured you'd talk when you were ready," he said, his voice gentle but honest, letting her know he wouldn't push. He'd learned long ago that truth, like trust, only came when offered freely. Lira took a deep breath, her gaze wavering, as if standing at the edge of a chasm, deciding whether to leap. Then she lifted her head, her golden eyes blazing in the sunset's red glow, and began to speak. "I'm a geoscientist," she started, her voice low, carrying a faint pride, like the weak light of a fading star. "I worked for the Belt Mining Coalition, studying energy crystals, ones that could power entire planets, keep colonies alive in harsh worlds like this." She paused, her eyes dropping to her hands, where bruises and scratches told the story she hadn't yet voiced. "Our work was hope, a future. But then a shipment of crystals vanished, billions of credits worth. The sector governor, a man named Koran, promised to investigate. He said he was on our side, that he'd find the thieves." Her voice turned bitter, the pride dissolving, replaced by the pain of betrayal. "But in the end, they needed a scapegoat. An alien, different enough that no one would question, no one would defend. I was the perfect choice." Caleb's jaw tightened, his muscles tensing, but he didn't interrupt. He knew this story. Powerful men weaving webs of lies, crushing anyone to keep their thrones. "They framed me," Lira continued, her voice shrinking, as if each word cost her to speak. "Forged data, made me look like the thief. I tried to run, to find someone who'd listen, who'd believe me. But bounties are cheaper than trials, faster than justice." She hugged herself, her gaze sinking into the shadows of memory. "I've been running ever since, through planets, supply stations, places where light never reaches." Caleb stepped closer, slow and careful, like approaching a wounded animal. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice low, certain, like a promise unwritten. Lira looked up, her golden eyes meeting his, and for the first time, he saw a trembling spark of hope flicker across her face, fragile but real. She opened her mouth, about to speak, but stopped, as if the next secret were too heavy to voice yet. Then she took a breath, her shoulders shaking faintly. "But that's not all," she said abruptly, her voice taut, like a string about to snap. "The crystals aren't just power sources. I was part of a covert group, scientists developing tech to harvest crystals and stabilize planetary cores, to stop colony worlds from collapsing. They could save billions, keep places like Jericho 9 from crumbling." She paused, her gaze wavering, as if deciding whether to go on. Then she spoke, her voice lower, almost a whisper. "But they can also be weaponized. Turned into planet-killer bombs, capable of wiping out entire star systems. They, Koran and those behind him, wanted me to help build it. When I refused, when I threatened to expose their plans, they made me their enemy." Caleb felt an icy weight slide into his gut. This wasn't just a theft or a small conspiracy. This was something that could shape the fate of the galaxy. How'd they find you? He asked, his voice low, fighting to stay calm as his mind reeled. Lira bowed her head, her eyes heavy with shame. I traded for medicine at a supply station 2 days ago, she said, her voice trembling. I thought I was careful, hid my tracks, but someone recognized me. They reported me for the bounty. Caleb shook his head, stepping closer, his gaze locked on her. You didn't lead them here. You survived. That's what matters. But Lira didn't look up. She hugged herself tighter, then said, her voice nearly breaking, there's more. I carry something they want. A data device implanted in me, under my skin. She touched her neck lightly, where the golden patterns pulsed. It holds the crystal harvesting formula, every secret of the project. If they get it, they could destroy dozens of worlds or force any planet to kneel. Caleb stared at her, stunned, the floor seeming to buckle beneath him. Lira wasn't just a fugitive scientist. She was the key to a doomsday weapon, a secret the galaxy would kill to possess. And now, that secret stood in his house, within reach of the hunters closing in. The rumble of engines vibrated through the stone floor, a deep, growling sound growing closer, like the heartbeat of a predator stalking its prey. The crimson light of Jericho 9's sunset drenched the house, staining everything in hues of dried blood. Caleb strapped the laser pistol's holster across his chest, his fingers brushing the worn metal grip, checking it one last time. He glanced at Lira, standing rigid by the kitchen table, her thin hands gripping its edge. Her golden eyes flickered with fear, but beneath it lay a resolve, like a flame that refused to die no matter how fiercely the wind blew. They're not here yet, Caleb said, his voice calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. But we don't have long. Lira swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the window, where the red dust trail on the horizon had thickened, a silent declaration of war. They want me alive, she said, her voice low but certain. They want the device. Caleb nodded, his mind racing, calculating every possibility. A hunter's skiff, its shape blurred through the dust, crested a hill with lethal speed. Not just one. A team. They hadn't come to negotiate. Lira stepped closer to him, instinctively seeking shelter, and Caleb turned, placing himself between her and the door, a living wall. We're not running, he said, his voice low, carrying the grit of a man who'd faced death before. There's a bunker under the shed. Not deep, but solid. We can hold out. Lira shook her head, her eyes sharp despite her trembling frame. They'll tear this place apart to find me, Caleb. And if they find you, they'll kill you without blinking. Caleb met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. Let them try, he said, and in that moment, he saw a spark of surprise cross her face, as if she'd never imagined someone would stand for her. The first explosion shattered the silence, a deafening blast slamming into the front porch, splintering wood and stone, debris flying across the yard. Caleb yanked Lira down behind the kitchen table, dust raining from the ceiling, coating their hair and shoulders. They don't waste time, he muttered, checking the laser pistol, his fingers gliding over the trigger. Lira crouched beside him, clutching a small handgun he'd given her earlier, her eyes sharp as a blade. Split them up? She asked, her voice tense but steady. Caleb's lips twitched in a dry smile. I like how you think. Another blast shattered a window, glass spraying, leaving gaping holes to the darkness outside. On my signal, he ordered, counting the enemy's firing rhythm. 1, 2, pause, then sprang up, firing 2 shots through the broken window. A bounty hunter staggered, his armor sparking, collapsing into the red dust. Lira moved like lightning, firing with precision from another angle, a shot hitting another hunter's shoulder, forcing the team into disarray amid the smoke and dust. They hadn't expected resistance. That was their first mistake. Caleb reached into an old emergency kit under the floor, pulling out a smoke grenade, yanking the pin, and hurling it into the yard. A thick fog erupted, blanketing the area in front of the house, disorienting the enemy. Run! He shouted, dragging Lira through the back door, crouching low through the red plains. Gunfire erupted behind them, panicked and off target, harmlessly churning the dirt. They ran, breaths ragged, to the old tool shed tucked behind the house. Caleb shoved Lira inside, slamming the door as a laser blast scorched the ground near his boots, leaving a blackened scar. In the cramped darkness of the shed they gasped for air, the smell of rusted metal and machine oil thick around them. "We can't get trapped here," Lira said, her voice firm despite her labored breathing. Caleb peered through a crack in the door, spotting the hunters' shapes moving in the smoke, regrouping. They weren't amateurs, they were trained, and they knew their target. "You any good at rigging makeshift weapons?" he asked, eyes still on the crack, hands checking his remaining ammo. Lira let out a tense, defiant chuckle. "I learned fast." They rummaged through the shed, finding an old fuel canister, a coil of rusted wire, and scraps of metal. With the speed of those who knew time was slipping away, they rigged a crude trap, the canister wired to explode into toxic smoke when triggered. A crazy plan, but it was all they had. The thud of boots grew closer, heavier. Caleb looked at Lira in the dark, their eyes meeting, no words needed. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, her golden eyes blazing, resolute. "With you." Caleb triggered the trap and kicked the door open. The canister detonated, spewing a thick cloud of toxic smoke. The nearest hunter screamed, clutching his mask, collapsing in agony. Caleb dropped him with a precise laser shot. Lira darted from the side, taking down another, her movements swift and lethal, like a deadly dance. They moved as one, covering each other, slipping into a nearby gully where jagged rocks shielded them from the barrage. Blood seeped from Lyra's old wound at her hip, staining her torn clothes, but she brushed it off, her focus unbroken. Caleb rose, firing to draw the enemy's attention. Lira struck from the flank, dropping two hunters with deadly accuracy. Caleb tackled the last one, grappling in the red dust, blood and sweat mixing. The hunter fled, fear finally overcoming greed. Caleb and Lira met in the scorched field, battered but alive. He touched her cheek, wiping away a streak of blood, his fingers trembling with adrenaline. She gripped his wrist, holding tight, her golden eyes burning, as if she wanted to speak but didn't need words. They'd survived, and in that moment, they both knew they'd been changed forever, bound by the fire of battle and the will to live. Jericho 9's sun rose, slow and merciless, casting a red-orange glow over the scorched red plains, where the scars of battle still smoldered. Caleb's house stood defiant though it bore the wounds of the fight, cracked stone walls, a shattered porch, and glass fragments glinting in the red dust like lost stars. Caleb leaned against the railing, his body aching, a deep purple bruise spreading across his ribs, each breath a reminder of the battle just past. The laser pistol hung limp in his hand, cold and heavy, a warning that peace was only an illusion. Not far off, Lira knelt beside the last surviving bounty hunter, her thin hands carefully bandaging his wounds, though blood still seeped through the rough cloth. Even after everything, the gunfire, the explosions, the fear, she chose to heal, not to destroy. Caleb watched her, his gaze softening, a quiet admiration stirring in his chest. She wasn't like him, untainted by the universe's darkness. Lira stood, wiping her hands on her torn shirt, her blazing golden eyes meeting his across the ruined yard. No words, just a slight nod, but it was enough to say they'd made it, that they still stood here, alive. For a fleeting moment, it felt like it was over. Caleb opened his mouth, about to say something, a reassurance, or maybe just her name, but a sharp whine tore through the sky, like a blade slicing the air. He tensed, his grip tightening on the pistol, his eyes scanning upward. A small patrol ship, bearing the gleaming silver insignia of the Belt Mining Coalition, touched down nearby, red dust swirling under its thrusters. Lira stepped closer to him, her voice trembling but low. "They haven't given up." Caleb felt an icy weight slide into his gut, but he kept his face calm, not wanting to frighten her further. A figure emerged from the ship, tall and lean in sleek black armor, moving with the confidence of someone in control. Not Koran, as he'd feared. Someone else, someone who made his heart skip a beat. Mira. His old comrade from the Interstellar Wars, the one who dragged him from a blood-soaked battlefield on Valthor when smoke and fire consumed everything. He'd seen her fall, or so he thought. He'd left a piece of his heart on that battlefield, believing her dead. But now she stood there, her short brown hair visible under her helmet, her eyes cold as steel, devoid of the warmth of the woman who'd once called him brother. "Caleb," Mira called, her voice sharp as a knife, cutting across the distance. "Hand her over. Don't make this harder." Each word was a stab, not for the threat, but for the raw betrayal it carried. Caleb stepped forward, shielding Lira, his muscles taut, the pistol half raised. "Mira," he growled, his voice low and heavy, like thunder before a storm. "What are you doing with them?" Myra's lips curled into a smile, devoid of warmth, as if their shared battles were a distant joke. "Surviving unlike you," she replied, her voice icy. "The Coalition pays better than memories, Caleb. She's worth more than both of us combined." Lira gripped Caleb's hand, her fingers trembling but firm, as if he were her only anchor against the abyss. "She's leading the hunters," she whispered, her voice soft but sharp, her eyes fixed on Mira. "She knows I'm here." Caleb's chest tightened, as if the air had been sucked out. Mira, his once sister, who'd shared long nights of stories under starry skies, now stood here, commanding those who sought Lyra's life. The betrayal wasn't just a blow, it cut deep, reopening old scars from the war, from the times he trusted and been left in the dark. "Walk away, Mira," he said, his voice low, each word heavy as stone. "You're not taking her." Mira laughed coldly, her gaze sweeping over him, as if he were a minor obstacle. "You were always stubborn, Caleb," she said, her voice tinged with mock regret. "But this time you've lost." She raised a hand, signaling, and from the ship, a combat drone emerged, its metal gleaming under the red sun. An armored beast, its laser turrets swiveling, aimed straight at the house. Its engines roared, low and menacing, like the growl of a predator ready to tear everything apart. Caleb tightened his grip on the pistol, his eyes never leaving Mira, but his mind already calculating terrain, weapons, odds of survival. The bunker under the shed could shield them, but not for long. This drone wasn't a toy, it was built to level targets, and Mira knew he wouldn't surrender easily. Lira stood close, her breathing quick, but her eyes steady. "Caleb," she said, her voice soft but firm. "If they get the device in me, it's over." He turned to her, their gazes locking, and in that moment, he saw not just fear, but a burning resolve. She was no longer just a fugitive, she was a warrior, like him. "They won't have it," he said, his voice certain, like a vow. "And they won't have you." Mira, from afar, laughed, as if she'd heard him. "Your time's up, Caleb," she called, her voice echoing across the scorched field. "Hand her over, or we level this place." Caleb pulled Lira back, his eyes fixed on the drone, his mind racing. The house, though sturdy, couldn't withstand a full assault. But he'd fought in worse odds, and this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Lira gripped his hand tighter, her golden eyes blazing like a fire in the dark. They weren't beaten, not yet. The drone's first laser blast tore through the front yard, a searing streak of light slicing the air, sending dirt and rock erupting in a small storm of red dust. Caleb yanked Lira into the house, his hand clamped around her wrist, not letting her slow for a second. Debris, wood, metal, flew everywhere, the sound of shattering glass a chaotic symphony. "Bunker!" Caleb shouted, his voice cutting through the drone's roaring engines overhead. He led Lira racing down the stairs to the bunker beneath the shed, their footsteps pounding on cold steel steps. The space below was cramped, its reinforced steel walls stained with rust, reeking of machine oil and dust. It was solid, but Caleb knew, against a combat drone like the one outside, this was only a temporary cage. The drone's roar echoed above, each blast shaking the ceiling, debris raining down, and somewhere, the sound of the roof being torn apart like paper. Lira gasped for breath, clutching her side, blood from her old wound seeping through her torn shirt, stark red against her pale blue skin. "They won't stop," she said, her voice tense but steady. "Not until they have the device in me." Caleb knelt in a corner, prying open an old metal crate, checking his meager arsenal: a laser rifle, a few EMP grenades, and an ancient jammer, its scratched casing still functional. "We'll make them pay," he said, his voice low, his eyes sharp as a blade. He handed Lira a compact handgun, small but deadly. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly but her gaze resolute, like a flame that wouldn't die. "I won't let them win," she said, and in that moment Caleb saw not just a fugitive scientist, but a warrior ready to face her fate. They devised a plan quickly, their voices urgent but clear. Caleb would rush outside, draw the drone's attention, while Lira used the jammer to disable it. But both knew the drone was just a weapon. Mira was the real threat, with her cold betrayal and tactical mind Caleb had once trusted. Caleb took a deep breath, nodded to Lira, and charged out through the back door, crouching low to dodge the hail of gunfire. He fired at the drone, green laser bolts tearing through the air, sparking against its armor but not penetrating. The drone swiveled its turret, engines screaming, chasing him across the red plains, each of Caleb's steps kicking up clouds of dust. He zigzagged, rolling over dunes, dodging blasts that cratered the ground. Lira, from the house, crawled through the rubble, clutching the jammer, her fingers flying over its controls. She activated it, an invisible pulse surging, making the drone stutter, wobbling midair, its signal lights flickering wildly. Caleb paused, panting, hope flaring, but then Myra's laugh rang out across the scorched field. "You think that toy's enough, Caleb?" She pressed the device on her wrist, and the drone recovered, engines roaring back, unleashing a barrage of lasers at Caleb. He rolled through the dust, dodging most, but a shard from an explosion lodged in his shoulder, sharp and searing. Blood flowed, soaking his shirt, but he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. Lira, from the house, saw him fall. A cry tore from her throat, not fear but fury, as if the universe had no right to take him from her. She charged outside, heedless of danger, her handgun raised, firing relentlessly at the drone, bolts striking its engine joints, forcing it to veer. Red dust swirled around her, her black hair whipping in the wind, her golden eyes blazing like fire. Mira advanced from the ship, rifle raised, her cold gaze locked on Lira. "Give me the device, Lira," she growled, her voice sharp as a blade. "Or you both die." Lira, hands trembling but eyes steady, fired back, a shot grazing Myra's armored shoulder, making her stagger. "Never!" Lira shouted, her voice ringing, carrying the defiance of someone who'd run too long and now chose to fight. Caleb, despite the pain, stood, blood dripping down his arm. He yanked an EMP grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and hurled it at the drone. The explosion rocked the air, the shockwave sending the drone crashing into the field, black smoke billowing from its shattered armor. But Mira stood firm, her eyes icy, unshaken. She advanced, rifle aimed at Caleb, a twisted smile on her lips. "You always make things hard, Caleb," she said, her voice tinged with mock regret. "But she's not worth dying for." Lira rushed to Caleb's side, standing between him and Mira, her handgun still gripped tight. "He's not alone," she said, her voice unwavering, her golden eyes locked on Mira. Caleb touched her shoulder, his breathing labored, but his eyes burned with unyielding resolve. "She wants the device, Lira," he whispered, his voice low. "But she won't get it. Not today!" He raised his pistol, arm shaking from blood loss, and aimed at Mira. The air between them was taut as a wire, one spark enough to ignite everything. Myra's cold laugh echoed, her finger brushing the trigger, but in her eyes Caleb saw a flicker of hesitation, a fragment of their old bond, when they'd been comrades, trusted each other. But it vanished quickly, and Jericho 9's shattered sky, choked with smoke and dust, became the arena for their final stand. Red dust swirled thickly across Jericho 9, cloaking the air like a bloody veil, as Mira, eyes blazing with fury, lunged at Caleb. She moved fast, like a trained predator, no trace left of the comrade who'd once stood by him in the wars. Caleb gritted his teeth, muscles taut, meeting her attack. They grappled in the scorched field, trading brutal blows, each strike a silent accusation. Dirt churned beneath their feet, their ragged breaths mixing with the clank of metal as Caleb tried to pin Myra's arms. A punch landed on his ribs, reigniting an old bruise, but he didn't back down. Lira, weakened, stood a few steps away, blood seeping from her hip wound, but she raised her handgun, her golden eyes sharp. She fired a shot into the air near Mira. The lasers screeched, tearing the silence, distracting Mira, making her stumble for a moment. Caleb seized the chance, pinning her to the ground, his knee on her chest, hands locking her wrists, holding her still in the red dust. "Why, Mira?" he roared, his voice low and raw, as if each word tore a piece of his heart to speak. His face was inches from hers, his eyes searching her cold gaze for a shred of the woman who'd saved his life on Valther's battlefields. But Mira only laughed, a bitter, twisted sound, devoid of warmth. "Because the Coalition knows you're alive, Caleb," she said, her voice low, sharp as a blade. "They wanted to use her to draw you out. She was just bait. You're the bigger prize, the last survivor of the Martian team, the one who knows the secret of their stolen nuclear arsenal." Myra's words struck like a dagger to Caleb's chest, leaving him stunned, his breath catching. The secret he'd buried since the war, the nuclear arsenal the Coalition stole from the Martian team, a classified project he and his squad had sworn to protect with their lives, was the chain dragging him into this hunt. He thought he'd escaped, vanished into Jericho 9's shadows, but the past never let go. Lira, nearby, heard every word, her golden eyes turning to him, filled with questions and a trace of fear, not of him, but of what this secret could unleash, a threat greater than her own flight. But there was no time to explain, no time to face the truth yanked from the dark. Lira stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Mira, her hand trembling but her voice steady. "They won't have me," she said, and before Caleb could grasp her intent, she raised her hand to her neck, where the golden patterns pulsed faintly. Her fingers brushed her blue skin, seeking a nearly invisible spot. With a wince of pain, she extracted a small crystal, shimmering like a miniature star, its inner light dancing as if holding a universe. The data device, the secret the Coalition craved, the formula to harvest crystals that could save or destroy dozens of worlds. She held it for a second, as if bidding farewell to a piece of herself, then raised it high, her eyes resolute. "They won't have it," she said, her voice ringing like a vow. Under Jericho 9's crimson sky, she smashed the crystal to the ground, her heel grinding it into glittering dust, its light snuffing out, like a fallen star. Mira screamed, a cry of rage and despair, thrashing under Caleb's weight. "You idiot!" she hissed, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You don't know what you've done!" But before she could act, Lira raised her gun, her gaze unflinching. A laser shot tore through the air, striking Myra's shoulder, sending her sprawling, blood seeping through her armor. Caleb released Mira, pulling Lira to run, not looking back. From afar, Myra's ship emitted a shrill distress signal, a piercing sound warning their time was short. The sky above rumbled with new engines, shadowy shapes approaching. Caleb grabbed Lyra's hand, dragging her into a nearby gully, where jagged rocks and darkness shielded them from prying eyes. In the gully, the air was cold and cramped, the scent of earth and blood mingling. Caleb panted, his shoulders still bleeding, but his eyes never left Lira. She slumped against a rock, her breath shallow, clutching her hip where her wound had reopened. The crystal was gone, but the cost of her act weighed heavily on them both. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said, his voice low, thick with emotion. "You could have kept it, used it to bargain." Lira shook her head, her golden eyes flaring in the dark. "No," she said, her voice firm. "If they had it, everything I fought for, every world, every life, would be lost. I couldn't let that happen." Caleb looked at her, a profound respect rising in his chest. She wasn't just a fugitive, not just a scientist. She was someone who'd chosen to sacrifice everything to stop the darkness from spreading. "And you?" she asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching his face. "Your secret, that arsenal, what is it?" Caleb bowed his head, the past flooding back like a tide, but he couldn't speak, not now. "A long story," he said, his voice hoarse. But I promise, Lira, I'll tell you. When we get out of here. She nodded faintly, her hand brushing his, a small gesture but enough to say she trusted him. In the gully's darkness, with distant engines rumbling, they sat, two hunted souls bound by secrets and survival. They weren't safe, but they had each other, and that, at least, was enough to keep fighting. The next day, the pale light of Jericho 9's dawn filtered through a bruised purple sky, bathing the red plains in a gentle hue, as if this harsh world wanted to offer a moment of peace. The field before Caleb's house was blackened, scarred with war's remnants, twisted metal, ash, and dried bloodstains. But the house stood, resilient as its owner, though its stone walls were cracked and its tiled roof pocked with holes. Caleb and Lira, battered but alive, sat beneath the lone dry tree still standing near the house, its bare branches reaching upward, a symbol of defiance. The air carried the acrid scent of smoke and scorched metal, but somewhere, a faint breeze stirred, bearing the breath of a new beginning. Lira knelt beside Caleb, her thin hands gentle but steady, bandaging the wound on his shoulder, where blood had dried in long streaks. The golden patterns on her arms pulsed faintly, but her pale blue skin seemed brighter, as if she'd reclaimed a piece of her lost strength. She tied the bandage, her fingers brushing his skin, careful as if he were something fragile. "You were the target," she said softly, her voice low, her golden eyes lifting to meet his, filled with gratitude and concern. "But you saved me, Caleb. Even knowing they wanted you more." Caleb took her hand, his scarred, rough palm enveloping her slender fingers, holding tight as if she might vanish. His gaze deepened, heavy with memories of war and loss, but lit with an unshakable sincerity. "And you saved me," he replied, his voice hoarse, each word weighty as a vow. They looked at each other, no more words needed, their eyes speaking of days spent fleeing, battles fought, and the moment they chose to stand together against the universe's darkness. Lira reached up, touching his cheek, her fingers wiping away a streak of dried blood, a tender gesture filled with meaning. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tinged with reproach, though her lips curved faintly. "I'll live," Caleb said, his mouth quirking into a lopsided, dry smile, warm despite the pain. "You should have seen the other guys." Lira laughed, a relieved, clear sound, like a small bell ringing through the ruined field. Her laughter pierced his heart, not with pain, but with a feeling he'd long forgotten, hope. He held her hand tighter, his fingers threading through her tangled black hair, feeling its softness. "You're not running anymore," he said, his voice firm, a declaration to the universe. Lira nodded faintly, her eyes bright, free of the shadows of flight. "If I can stay," she replied, her voice soft but meaningful, an invitation into her world. Caleb lifted her hand, pressing a reverent kiss to the back of it, as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever touched. "You're already home," he said, his voice low, each word a promise unwritten. Lira leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, her warmth spreading, chasing away Jericho 9's morning chill. They sat in fragile silence, only the faint wind and their steady heartbeats filling the space. "In my people's tradition," Lira said, her voice soft, like sharing a secret, "home isn't just a place. It's a promise, a choice. We call the one we choose our bondmate, not just for love, but for the heart, the one who'll stand with you, even when the universe turns away." Caleb tightened his hold, his chest opening, letting light flood the dark corners long sealed. "Call me anything, Lira," he said, his voice rough, his eyes locked on hers. "Just don't leave." She looked up, her golden eyes shining like stars in Jericho 9's sky, and whispered, "Bondmate." The word fell soft but powerful, like a stone rippling a lake. Caleb pulled her closer, their foreheads touching, their breaths mingling. "Forever," he vowed, his voice certain, as if no darkness in the universe could break that oath. Under Jericho 9's sky, where purple clouds parted to reveal the first light of day, two broken souls began to mend, piece by piece, moment by moment. Their wounds, Caleb's scars, Lira's blood, were only traces of the past, not their future's fate. They sat, hand in hand, gazing at the scorched field, where tiny green sprouts, nearly invisible, pushed through the blackened earth, stubborn and silent, like them. The house behind, though battered, was where they'd fought and won, not just against enemies, but against the loneliness that had once caged them both. Far off, the hum of rescue ships had faded, Mira and her team likely retreated or recalled by new orders. But Caleb and Lira knew their war wasn't truly over. The coalition lingered out there, with its dark secrets and ambitions. Caleb's secret about the nuclear arsenal and Lira's destroyed data device remained specters that could return. But now, they weren't lone fugitives. They were a team, a family, a promise carved deeper than any scar. Lira looked up, her eyes sparkling, no longer those of a hunted soul, but of someone who'd found a reason to live. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice light but curious, brimming with hope. Caleb gazed at the field, where those tiny sprouts reached upward, and smiled. "We rebuild," he said. "The house, the field, ourselves. Together." Lira nodded, her hand tightening in his, and in that moment, under Jericho 9's fractured sky, they knew that whatever the future held, they'd face it, as bondmates, as survivors, as lovers too fierce to be torn apart.